Yes!
The topic of sunsetting and legendary weapons of armor in Destiny 2 will always be something that the Destiny community may have to come to terms with and understand why it's happening, but for the most part, the vast majority of the fan base will never be happy with it. We've just learned to accept it and try to look on the bright side of things because, believe it or not, there are a lot of pros to sunsetting gear despite the fact that the cons may be a lot more apparent. However, when it was confirmed that all legendary weapons of armor would have limited lifespans, there were three main things that came to everybody's mind at the same time. Number one was the amount of time spent using these weapons. Number two was the amount of time you put into getting those particular perk rolls that come together on the same weapons. And number three was dealing with the realization that you would have to replace these weapons. Weapons in the Destiny franchise are special because they're categorized and divided into different archetypes based on their impact and rate of fire. For example, I'm a huge pulse rifle advocate, but I prefer the faster rate of fire archetypes for the most part. So it's safe to say that there's a weapon type for everybody, and it's incredibly unlikely that you won't be able to find something that you will like. But on the same note, when you use a weapon for a long time, you basically develop a relationship with it. You master it, and you know when it's most suitable to be used and or not to be used. And seeing the kill counter rise is one of the most satisfying things in the game, especially for a collector. One of the major complaints about the Destiny games that any Destiny player could tell you is that it always seems that Bungie never respects the amount of time that people put into this game. I remember back in the D1 days, I would see people grind their lives away to get a Gallahorn, only for their friend who just picked up the game last week to obtain that same weapon from a random strike. Of course, RNG was the sole contributing factor of getting certain weapons of armor back in D1, but this remained a part of the Destiny culture for so long, it'll always suck to think about it. This is one of the first things that comes to mind when you realize that gear will no longer be infusible past a certain point. And speaking of not respecting time, when it comes to RNG, there's nothing that'll ever guarantee that you will ever get your personal dream roll on your weapons. It's 100% random, and those who are incredibly devoted to the grind will hopefully at some point in time get the exact roll or close to the roll that they've been farming and grinding for. But you want to know what really sucks? You probably spent months grinding your literal soul away in the Reckoning trying to get that perfectly rolled spare rations, and now it doesn't even matter because it won't be viable in the in-game activities where power level matters since it can't be infused past 1060 power. Of course, you'll be able to use your sunset gear in non-power level based activities, but who wants to micromanage their loadouts like that? It's a lot less of a hassle to just replace everything to save yourself the headache instead of holding on to something that has less viability than the new stuff. Nobody is stopping you from putting your sunset gear in a vault and keeping it for the memories though. But yeah, now that we discussed the obvious things about gear sunsetting, there's several more things that I want to talk about. So without further ado, let's get it in. First things first, let's talk about why Bungie is really doing this and why they think that it's a good idea. Alright, so let's look at the last 2 years of Destiny 2, specifically a little bit after the Forsaken DLC launch, which kicked off year 2 of Destiny 2, as well as Destiny 2's 4th season. When Forsaken came out, randomly rolled perks on weapons made their return, and from that point on, the Destiny community was happy to know that a huge part of the culture of the franchise was back and here to stay. However, there was one major problem that derived from this in the form of access of lethality and reload speed perks available on every weapon. After Forsaken release, every weapon had access to either a reload speed perk like Outlaw, a lethality perk such as Rampage, or both. Kill Clip and Rampage became available on weapons that didn't even make sense. For example, this rocket launcher can roll Kill Clip. Kill Clip on a rocket launcher? Who in their right mind thought that this was a good idea, and who in the world is going out of their way to farm for a rocket launcher with Kill Clip? That's literal overkill because anything hit by a rocket launcher is more than likely gonna die anyways, provided that it isn't a boss or some sort of powerful in-game PvE enemy. Because of this, a stagnated facade was born in the Destiny community stating that outlawing Kill Clip on any weapon makes it a god roll weapon, and or these perks are necessary for a weapon to be considered a god roll. And that couldn't have been more far away from the truth, especially when we have amazing perks like rangefinder and explosive payload that may not fulfill the same role as a reload speed or lethality perk, but they're just as amazing, if not more viable in certain situations. Back in Destiny 1, Outlaw and Feeding Frenzy function the same way as they do in Destiny 2, but Kill Clip was known as reactive reload, and Rampage was known as crowd control. They were the exact same perks, but they weren't available on every single weapon in the game like they are in Destiny 2. For example, sidearms could roll reactive reload and crowd control, but auto rifles could only roll crowd control. I personally felt that this was very balanced, and in D1, there was a lot of useless perks used as filler to bloat the perk pools for weapons, so getting a perfectly rolled weapon felt so much more satisfying back then. But in D2, it was only 3 or 4 different perks that everybody would go for. And to be honest, it made hunting for new weapons boring. And I really paid attention to this when all of my go-to PvP and PvE weapons had either Outlaw, Rampage, Kill Clip, or Feeding Frenzy. Because in addition to Outlaw and Rampage or Kill Clip being the go-to role on almost every weapon in the game, supers in PvP were also incredibly overpowered, and without team shots, a heavy weapon, or super of your own, it was almost impossible to contest an enemy using their super and live to tell the tale. And in my honest opinion, I'm pretty sure that any and everybody would agree with this. But Bungie's goal was to completely break the game and make everything as overpowered as possible. This is because year 1 of Destiny 2 was in the worst imaginable state. We were forced to use double primary weapons, ability cooldowns, and PvP times to kill were slow, and there was no presence of power fantasy at all. But when year 2 first kicked off, everything was beyond overpowered, and from Bungie's perspective, if everything is overpowered, then there can never be a time where the community would complain about a lack of power fantasy. Unfortunately, throwing Outlaw and Kill Clip doesn't give every weapon a fighting chance like they thought it would. It makes every weapon boring and removes all of the desire to go for other perks. Over the course of year 2 and year 3, all of the reload speed and lethality perks, as well as super damage reduction, was nerfed. And Bungie did this to lessen the potency of the fallacy that these perks are must-haves on every weapon, and to remove the end-all be-all aspect of supers in PvP. Now if you notice, all of the 7 Seraph weapons introduced in Season of the Worthy didn't have the best perk pools. To my acknowledgement, none of these weapons can roll Kill Clip and Outlaw at the same time, and for the most part, it seems that Swashbuckler and Vorpal Weapon are the new increased weapon damage perks that Bungie were prioritizing. And when I noticed this, I told myself that in year 4, we're more than likely going back to the D1 days of certain perks not being available on certain weapons and or archetypes. I've lost count how many times I've talked about pinnacle weapons in the past, so this section is going to be very brief. On my channel, there are 2 videos titled What is a Pinnacle Weapon and another one titled Why Were Pinnacle Weapons Discontinued. I have links in the description box, so feel free to check those out when you have a moment. But anyways, pinnacle weapons were very powerful, and in some way, shape, or form, most if not all of the pinnacle PvP weapons were nerfed because they did entirely too much to be simply referred to as legendary weapons. Not Forgotten, Revoker, Mountaintop, and Recluse were all at some point in time a nuisance to deal with, and it's no denying that they outperformed some of, if not most of, the exotic weapons primarily used in PvP. Bungie really had their work cut out for them when it came to dealing with pinnacle weapons, and I know for a fact that it became tiresome to keep nerfing them, so it was much easier to sunset them alongside all other legendary weapons in the game. Unfortunately, a lot of people didn't take kindly to this and currently feel that the amount of grind invested towards attaining these weapons pretty much became pointless. Let's be real, one of the major complaints about Destiny is that it gets boring from time to time, and there are times where you really need to take a break. I 100% agree with this, but there are a lot of times where people do things that makes the game even less fun for themselves. I'm referring to those that don't ever switch their weapons up at all. There's plenty of people who play Destiny 2 that have 10,000 plus kills on multiple weapons, and that could derive from not switching your weapons around enough, or playing the game a lot, or both. When the Black Armory DLC first came out, and when the Izanami Force first released, the very first blast furnace that ever dropped from that forge for me rolled with Outlaw, Rampage, and a Stability Masterwork, and it was my most used PvE primary weapon for several seasons. Now I managed to achieve over 20,000 PvE kills with it, but over time I noticed that I didn't enjoy using it as much. Don't get me wrong, I'll always love blast furnace, but there were newer and more exciting weapons being released, and I wanted to experience those ones instead. Black Armory came out in December of 2018. And this Sacred Provenance didn't drop for me until April of 2020, so for almost an entire year and a half, I finally ended up retiring the Blast Furnace. I saw this as a great opportunity because the Sacred Provenance that I obtained rolled amazingly, and it's in the same archetype as Blast Furnace. And to keep all of my weapons feeling fresh and avoid getting bored of them, I've always made it an obligation for all of my Guardians to have their own loadouts. All of them use their own weapons, and I never switch my weapons from one character to another unless I'm using a staple exotic weapon for a boss DPS phase, for a raid, or some sort of in-game PvE activity, or something meta-friendly for trials so I can comfortably compete. Exotic weapons have always had to compete with legendary weapons, even back in Destiny 1, and it's very obvious why. For one, exotic weapons are unique and incapable of random rolls like legendary weapons, and you can only use use one exotic weapon at a time. This means that if anybody is going to use an exotic weapon, it has to 100% be worth it. There has to be an equal balance of uniqueness and power fantasy, because if an exotic weapon's only selling point is that it's unique, then it has no selling point at all, because all exotic weapons are unique. I'll be honest with myself when I say that during my entire Destiny career, I've never really used exotic weapons that much outside of the boss DPS staples. But ever since Bungie announced that all legendary weapons will eventually be sunset, I started using more of the exotic primary weapons more often, such as Outbreak Perfected and Bad Juju. And due to the fact that exotic weapons won't be affected by the sunsetting, this would be a perfect opportunity to start using exotic weapons that you never gave a chance before. Now let's move on to the part of the video where I discuss what I hope that Bungie ends up doing, as well as what I think would make the most sense. Okay, so earlier I talked very extensively about the lethality perks, such as Kill Clip and Rampage, as well as the reload speed perks, such as Outlaw and Feeding Frenzy. As stated previously, these perks weren't available on every weapon in Destiny 1, and I preferred it that way, because in Destiny 1, weapons had a strong sense of uniqueness that the weapons in Destiny 2 have never seemed to have. I'm pretty sure that Bungie will never make the mistake of mindlessly throwing these perks on every weapon like they did when Forsaken first came out, but I wouldn't be against it if we went back to the D1 days where only certain weapons could roll certain perks. After the House of Wolves DLC era ended, leading into the release of the Taken King DLC in Destiny 1, pulse rifles lost the ability to roll reactive reload, and the House of Wolves era pulse rifle known as Hopscotch Pilgrim was majorly to blame for this. At one point in time, Hopscotch Pilgrim was a high impact archetype pulse rifle that could reliably 2-burst in PvP with reactive reload, but it was eventually moved to the adaptive frame archetype. This weapon was incredibly dominant, and back at D1 it was commonplace for things to get nerfed into the ground if they were too powerful or dominant, so it was no surprise that Hopscotch Pilgrim was changed. One of the more frustrating things about Destiny 2 has obviously been the fact that randomly rolled weapons were discontinued in favor of static rolled weapons with single trait perks. As stated previously, this was mitigated when the Forsaken expansion released, but if you decided to re-experience Year 1 content, you would only receive static rolled weapons as rewards, since the vast majority of the content in Year 1 was never updated. However, when Armor 2.0 was introduced in Destiny 2, this system made all of the armor in Destiny 2 at least somewhat useful. This was a very frustrating realization that made most of, if not all, the content in Year 1 pointless. Also, Destiny 2 is going into Year 4 and we've never had a true vendor refresh. And at this point in time in the game's life cycle, we're very overdue for a vendor refresh. And with all things considered, I think it's a much better idea to remove pointless content from the game and replace it with something brand new, instead of giving lackluster loot the potential to drop in game. The farther we get into Year 4, the more pointless it'll be to receive weapon and armor drops that made their debut from Seasons 1 to 8, because they won't be useful in the end game. Since every weapon introduced from Seasons 1 to 8 will be sunset, it would be a much better idea to just remove them from the game entirely. This is why I'm actually happy that Io, Mercury, Mars, and Titan are being sent to the Destiny content vault, because they serve very little purpose in the game right now. Back in Destiny 1, certain weapons were unable to be obtained outside of the DLC era that they were released in, and I wouldn't be upset with Bungie if they decided to do this in Destiny 2, to some extent. One thing that really annoyed me when Destiny 2 entered Year 2 is that randomly rolled weapons returned, but randomly rolled elements didn't. I'll never understand why this happened in the first place, especially when you consider that all weapons in Destiny 1 were capable of randomly rolled perks and randomly rolled elements. And back in Year 1 of Destiny 2, the elements were literally weapon mods that could be changed whenever you please. Now I spoke on this in a video I released very early in Year 2. Check this out. So yeah, I would be overjoyed if randomly rolled elements made a return. I understand why Bungie removed elemental weapon mods from the game, but there's really no reasoning behind the fact that every elemental weapon has to be stuck with one element. In the final section, I'll talk about what I honestly believe that Bungie will end up doing based on what they've done in the past. Earlier, we talked about pinnacle weapons and the amount of grind required to obtain them, as well as the frustration factor of realizing that pinnacle weapons will also be sunset as well. However, to mitigate some of the annoyance of this, Bungie stated that they'll be introducing what's known as pursuit weapons, which may not be as powerful and unique as pinnacle weapons, but they'll definitely be viable nonetheless. Take a look at Feldwinter's Line, for example. This weapon is what will be considered to be a perfect role based on being a member of the most popular shotgun archetype for PvP, and due to the fact that it comes with 4 different trait perks that you can choose between, Feldwinter's Line instantly became a fan favorite, which is amazing because there never existed a pinnacle shotgun on par with Feldwinter's Line for PvP. If Bungie keeps releasing weapons as amazing as Feldwinter, I'm for certain that everybody will be more than satisfied. One thing that has always annoyed me is the fact that Bungie is terrible when it comes to introducing a variety of different weapon archetypes when it comes to new weapons. Since Destiny 1, I've been a pulse rifle fanatic, and my favorite archetype will always be the 450 RPM lightweight pulse rifles, and from this point on, I'll always be referring to the 450 RPM lightweight frame pulse rifles, not the 450 RPM aggressive frames. I mentioned that random rolls made their debut in Destiny 2 in the Forsaken expansion, and when they did, we were given one 450 RPM pulse in the form of Chattering Bone from the Last Wish raid. In Season 6, Nightshade returned with random rolls, but this wasn't a new weapon since it was available in Year 1 of Destiny 2, as well as Destiny 2's beta. Then finally, in Season 9, the Infinite Pass 8 from Curse of Osiris was given a random rolls treatment, but this version of the weapon was only available in the season that it was introduced in, meaning that if you missed out, you weren't getting your hands on it at all. So if you think about it, we've only received one brand new 450 RPM pulse rifle in the past 2 years. My second favorite pulse rifle archetype are the 540 RPM rapid fire frames, and this archetype is in a very similar boat because all three of the random rolls capable 540 RPM pulses are in the energy slot. And to make matters worse, this archetype hasn't received a new member since Season 6. Now I'm certain that there's a handful of other weapon archetypes that don't get any love, but I specifically noticed these two archetypes since they're my personal favorites. So I really hope that Bungie focuses on showing some love to the less supported weapon archetypes, because the plan of retiring all of our weapons will be pointless if they're simply going to ignore the fact that there are some weapon archetypes that they obviously forgot about. Piggybacking off of the lack of archetype variety topic, I'm gonna go ahead and say that if Bungie doesn't release a ton of weapons in Season 12, then sunsetting will be even more pointless. Many of us have been using the same weapons for almost 2 years now, and everybody who plays Destiny 2 frequently are looking for replacements for their weapons that'll be retired soon. If there isn't some way to replace every weapon, that'll be a very, very frustrating realization, because if Bungie gives some TLC to all of the weapon archetypes, then it'll be safe to say that they didn't leave a single stone unturned. But we can only hope. Alright everybody, that does it for this one. I wasn't too happy when I found out that all of my legendary weapons or armor will have limited lifespans, but I came to grips with it when I realized that we're overdue to receive a bunch of new gear. In the comment section, tell me how you feel about the sunsetting, and tell me if you've been grinding in Season 11 to try and replace some of your favorite weapons. Now if you made it to the end of this video, do me a favor and thumb rush to that like button until it turns blue. Now if you're new to my neck of the woods, go ahead and subscribe to the channel and click that bell icon so you don't miss a video of the most elite gaming content. But with that being stated, 1LHD is over and out. Y'all take it easy.